Hello, everyone, and welcome. So we are now live, and the meeting recording has begun. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's neighborhood meeting. My name is Dana Suddaby, and I'm a planner with the city's Development Services Department. I'm going to run through a bit of a script just to go over the virtual aspects of the meeting. So just bear with me for a few moments. So tonight, the focus of the meeting will be on a proposed application for an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment at the corner of Mapleview Drive West and Essa Road. So please be aware that we are recording this meeting, and all information provided is being collected and will be used for the purpose of garnering your input and to respond to inquiries and to be notified of future meetings and will be considered public information. So should you have any questions regarding this collection, please contact the Development Services Department. So I would like to let everyone know that there are staff behind the scenes managing the technology tonight. They have the ability to interrupt the meeting at any time, and they will endeavor to allow the applicant and each member of the public an opportunity to speak. So please bear with us if you have any issues. So tonight's meeting overview and expectation. So tonight's meeting is not a statutory requirement under the Planning Act. So as the application is in the initial stages of the review process, the intent of tonight's meeting is more so to provide members of the public with an opportunity to become familiar with the development applications and the planning review process, and also ask the applicant questions and provide feedback. So what should you be expecting from the virtual neighborhood meeting? So a presentation from the applicant's representative describing their proposal, a brief overview of the city's review process and timing, and an opportunity to ask questions of either the applicant or city staff and provide comments or identify concerns with the application. So what not to expect? City staff recommendations on the application or a detailed analysis on the proposal. This is going to occur later in the review process. Or a debate on the merits of the proposal between city staff and the applicant. So once we move forward onto the question A period, if you wish to speak or ask a question, you're required to use the meeting controls to raise your virtual hand. So you can find this raise your hand button and other meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. So for those of you who are joining us by phone, you can press number 9 to raise your virtual hand. And when you're called on to speak, you can press 6 to unmute yourself. So you'll be called by name to speak, and then you'll have to please unmute yourself and then clearly state your name and address and provide your comment and or question. So as we work through the questions and comments later in the meeting, I respectfully request that the members of the public please avoid repeating the same questions and comments over again. Once a specific matter has been identified, it will be documented and the applicant will either provide a response verbally this evening or provide a response later in the process during the public meeting or in written format through the subsequent submissions. So this approach will allow us to have a productive meeting and conclude the meeting as scheduled. So please note, there is a chat function, but it's intended to be used if you have any technical issues with the Zoom platform. Any questions regarding the application, please raise your virtual hand and your questions will be answered. Because the questions, the chat is not available to all of the participants, so not everyone can see it. So those of you that have registered for the meeting by providing a mailing address or email address, you'll be added to our mailing list to receive further information on the application. So before we get into the presentations, I just wanted to quickly highlight the next steps in the application process. So we are currently in the initial stages of the process. The application has completed its pre-consultation technical review with a variety of internal city staff and external agencies. After tonight's meeting, the applicant will need to incorporate comments received in this neighborhood meeting and submit their applications for an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment, as well as a future site plan approval application. With these formal submissions, we will occur a renewed review process where comments received from the city's technical groups and external agencies, as well as members of the public, will be incorporated. The neighborhood meeting is established early in the development process to ensure the local concerns are incorporated or addressed through the city's review. Following tonight's meeting and the submissions of formal applications, there will be a public meeting with council in the late fall or early winter period. The public meeting is a statutory requirement under the Planning Act, and everyone who's registered for tonight's meeting, as well as all property owners within 120 meters of the subject lands will be notified of the public meeting. The public meeting will also be held virtually, similar to tonight's meeting. So at the public meeting, the applicants will present the applications to council and again answer questions. At the public meeting, applicants generally identify that the neighborhood meeting has been held and provide an overview of the response to issues and concerns identified at the meeting. Members of the public will again have an opportunity to provide either written or verbal comments at the public meeting. Following the public meeting that is held, staff will continue the technical review process associated with the applications, and the applicants may make any necessary revisions to the development proposal. Once the review process has concluded, a staff recommendation report will be brought forward to council for their consideration. All comments received throughout the review process, including those received at the neighborhood meeting and public meetings, will be identified and addressed in the staff report and will form part of staff's recommendation on the subject application. A staff report for the applications will likely be brought forward to council sometime in the first quarter of 2021. So I will now move on to the applicant's presentation, and as I mentioned, the application will be first presented, followed by a question and comment period. So tonight we're going to be focusing on an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment application located at Mapleview Drive West and Essa Road. So there are 5 properties at Mapleview Drive West and Essa Road, known as 320 and 364 Mapleview Drive West, and 664, 674, and 692 Essa Road. So we have Drew Sinclair from SBN Planners and Architects, and he is going to lead the presentation. So just a quick overview of their proposal, and Drew will go into more details. The current land use designation is general industrial, and the current zoning is light industrial, general commercial, C4, and general commercial special provision, 386, which would require the lands to be subject to an analysis for an employment land conversion. So I just have a quick reminder before I hand the presentation over to Drew. So we're now going to go into, we're going to go into Drew's presentation, and then I will explain how to raise your virtual hand. So Drew, I will pass the ball over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dana. First off, I just want to admit how I wasn't, since I'm on Zoom calls about 8 hours a day these days, I didn't expect to be as nervous as I am. So I apologize if I stumble through this a little bit, but thank you very much, Dana, for that introduction. And I think you've provided a really thorough overview of where we are in the process. Before I go into the presentation, I'd like to just acknowledge, I've noticed that the councillor, Gary Harvey, is present. So for those attending, just to acknowledge the councillor is in attendance, and also some other members of our own team, including the developer Blake Larson, who will be here for a portion of the presentation, but unfortunately isn't able to stay the entirety of the evening, and my partner Shonda Wang, our lead urban designer. My name is Drew Sinclair. I'm an architect and urban designer, and I'm the managing principal of a firm based out of Toronto, Winnipeg, and Ottawa called SVN Architects and Planners. We began working on this site almost a year ago now, and we've gone through, I'd say, only the most preliminary phases of this process. We've developed a high-level master plan, and I call it high-level because it's still, for lack of a better word, plastic in nature. We've had conversations to date, and I'll tell you a bit more about those, with the neighbors to the immediate north and to the immediate east of the site, and a number of other institutional partners within the community. And we've had an ongoing series of conversations with city staff, the councillor, mayor, and other members of council, and all with the intent or purpose of putting together a comprehensive proposal that really meets the objectives of both the city and the community and the development team. With that in mind, I'll call the proposal plastic because it's still very much a work in progress. And so the intent is tonight to present the vision in its current form. And as Dana mentioned, it's a critical part of the municipal process that the input from tonight's meeting is paired with the feedback we've received to date from city staff through our initial engagements, but also the councillor and other stakeholders and constituents within the neighborhood. And those inputs will be further assimilated into the proposal before it goes forward, before it's actually submitted to the city. So what you're seeing tonight has not been submitted in any form other than in the form of this presentation to the city. It doesn't yet have status. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, it will change subject to some of the inputs we hear tonight. With all of your agreement, I'll begin to share the presentation. Thank you. So to provide you a very brief overview of the team involved in this development, Seven Generations Development Group is a BC and Ontario-based developer led by Blake Larson. As I mentioned, Blake is in attendance tonight. This is a new development, a new scale for Seven Generations. We're working with Seven Generations on a number of sites, including on affordable rental housing in Angus and a number of other properties in Regina and Barrie. SVN Architects and Planners are the planners and architects on this team. I mentioned already my partner Shonda. We have a number of our team members on this call as well, including Michael Mathis and Blair Scorgi, the core of our planning team. The civil engineering component of the team is Tatham, who does a lot of work in the Barrie area. Many of you are probably familiar with Tatham, as you are with Barristan Law, one of the leading legal firms working on issues around municipal law within the city of Barrie. Milbourne Real Estate is a long-term advisor of ours, and they're working with the development team on specifically the form of residential development that would be suitable on this site. CBRE is a name familiar to most of you, I'm sure, as well. And CBRE is in a similar position as advisors on the commercial real estate side, really to help provide the development team with a really complete mix of, or an understanding of the complete mix of the types of commercial uses that'll be most viable on the site. And most importantly, and one of the long ambitions of this project is to really do a fulsome mix and variety of non-residential or commercial uses here. And so CBRE are a really critical team member. Blackjet has been working with us on the vision, trying to assure that there's a really thorough and fulsome consideration of the place and the placemaking strategy. How do we combine a vision for the architecture, the landscape, the retail, the commercial, all of the amenities focusing on wellness, and how can we make it work together so that it really makes best advantage of this beautiful place and the existing community surrounding. Royal LePage and specifically Todd Georgis's team are present tonight as well, and they're going to be a critical part of moving this project forward over the next years and decades as this project builds out over time. You've already heard from the city. On the left here is the agenda. I'm going through the presentation now, but at a very high level, I've already stated outright that what we're showing you tonight is a work in progress, that there's we're fully anticipating the feedback that you provide this evening to shape the form of the submission that we eventually make to the city. Of critical importance to us is not simply the comments on the size of the buildings or the shape of the buildings or even the look, but also the types of things that happen at the ground floor. What happens on the street fronts? What types of retail are most important to you? What do you think is lacking within the existing community? What can come within this development that would be of the greatest benefit to all of the existing residents within the Holly neighborhood and the surrounding community, and ultimately to the city over time? We're trying to create a profile for a great neighborhood with lots of great neighborhood places. And so understanding your feelings about the existing place, how it can be amplified and bettered, improved, but ultimately what you treasure most about the neighborhood and how that could reflect into the plan is of critical importance to us. We want to hear your concerns. If there are elements within the plan that you're not in agreement with or you have specific questions about, we'd like to hear that, because it's a critically important part of this process that we have a fulsome and honest conversation about what we're doing. And maybe more than anything, we want to hear what you think about the plan and the plan in its draft form. The site, as you're familiar with, I'm certain, is at the intersection of Mapleview and Essa Road. I'll go through the statistics in a moment, but it's important to, I think, share that our analysis, when we begin as planners and architects looking at a site like this, we start at about this scale, looking at the entirety of the city and trying to understand where this site fits into both the physical place, where it sits into the city, understanding that Essa has been, for generations, a significant entry point into the city just before it falls down the ridge towards the bay and downtown. It's also, over the last few years, been an extraordinary epicenter for new development, new residential communities, mostly low-rise residential communities, but new communities coming into the city. We're also very, very aware of the way this site fits into the broader network of public transportation and amenities that serve all the residents in Barrie. And so one of our key interests is in the elements outside of the development within, maybe it's enhanced transit or other types of amenities that can serve the broader community. So we've included this map that shows the Allendale Waterfront GO station, downtown, of course, Barrie South GO, further along Mapleview to the east. Both of which we're anticipating or desiring of enhanced connections from this site to those for the benefit of this community and the existing community surrounding. I mentioned a moment ago, we're about a 10-minute drive from those two GO stations, and obviously along direct transit line connections. Transit Route 103 connects directly to the core and the Allendale GO station. Route 6 obviously connects to downtown Barrie, South Barrie, and other destinations. There are planned enhancements along Essa and Mapleview, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, that include the provision of dedicated bicycle lanes. And so we're conscious of the fact that, one, there are going to be changes to those roads around the site, and in all likelihood, this development will play a role in advancing some of those investments. We also know that when bicycle lanes, or what we call active transportation, comes that close to a property like this, it's really important that its presence begins to inflect and begins to alter the plan, so that we're making a space for bicycles, and we're making a space for enhanced pedestrian networks, and ultimately for wheelchairs and accessibility in the property. And you'll get a sense of that when we go into the master plan view. We know that we're within a very short driving distance, almost a walking distance, to Highway 400. But what it speaks to really is how networked and how connected this site is, both to, I think, to the west, a very wonderful and stable residential neighborhood, and to the east, a significant amount of commercial development and commercial and industrial development that is beginning to transition and will continue to transition over time. This is zooming in a little bit further to understand the exact site. The site itself is 25 acres in total. You can see the thin green line that runs through the site, and many of you probably know this already. That's Bear Creek. Bear Creek, to the west of Essa, has been changed and altered over time, and in a few locations, including behind the Shoppers Drug Mart, returned to a semi-natural state. Across this site, Bear Creek is in a relatively degraded state. It's in effect a surface channel that for much of the year is silted in and doesn't accommodate surface flows in a clear way. The most regular activity in Bear Creek on this site has been dredging every 20 or 25 years or so when the creek fills in. You'll see a major part of this proposal is to return Bear Creek to again a natural state, but as part of an enhanced park landscape that would be accessible to all residents and connected in through a series of public trails to the broader neighborhood surrounding. What's shown in green is the parks that many of you know in the neighborhood surrounding. In blue is institutional uses, and institutional does include things like churches. And to the immediate east, you're probably familiar with Mapleview Church. We've had a good series of meetings with Pastor Jay and the community in the church to understand how our development can meet their objectives over time and really accommodate some of their very specific congregational needs. We have a similar set of conversations, and I'm sorry that it's not shown here in green, but Holy Spirit Parish, the Catholic Church, the immediate north of the site, we've had a series of working meetings with them as well to speak about how this development can specifically support them meeting their long-term goals for a sustainable growth of their congregation, and also how their congregational needs are changing over time, the types of housing they want or desire. But this gives you a sense of what the landscape is like surrounding. To the immediate east, beyond Mapleview Church, are existing employment lands. To the south, a mix of employment lands, mostly car dealerships and existing commercial properties to the south. Has Dana provided you an overview already of where we are in this process? The draft master plan we're reviewing tonight has been developed over the preceding months. We are moving towards a rezoning and official plan amendment submission. So tonight I'll be speaking mostly about the zoning. The official plan amendment I'll speak to in a moment. But this is public meeting 1. As Dana mentioned, we're anticipating ideally moving towards the statutory public meeting number 2 within the later parts of 2020, early 2021. But most importantly in this chart is where we are relative to the rezoning, and that we have not yet submitted. So the inputs of tonight's meeting will be included within the application. Stage 3 shown here, if you're not familiar with what development applications go through. Site plan application is a much more detailed review of the engineering of the development itself and the aesthetics, the details of the buildings and the landscape. It will generally take place once the zoning is approved. And so we don't yet have a time frame. It's subject to the review process with the city for zoning approval, but the site plan application will come later. Right now we're in phase 2. I mentioned already that we've begun a process of engagement with the stakeholders surrounding the site. Here's a short inventory of the conversations that have taken place to date. And this is, I would suggest, the official meetings that took place with multiple members of our group and our development team and the landowners and institutional neighbors. There's been a whole series of informal meetings that have taken place as well. When a project like this begins on a 25-acre piece of land, there's two approaches, and I think we subscribe to we'll call it the more democratic of those two, which is to begin the process not with a vision of built form, but with a series of conversations to try to understand what the community and neighborhood needs and requires. You can see we began in our initial conversations, the landowners began their initial conversations with city staff earlier in the fall of 2019. And then the conversations around this specific development proposal began in December 2019, again, about 9 months ago. Those conversations carried on through the early spring when we were still able to meet in person, if any of you can remember that, and transition to Zoom or computer-based calls later in the year. We've been meeting regularly with the Conservation Authority as the plans for the rehabilitation of Bear Creek develop, and then of course with our institutional neighbors, Holy Spirit Parish and Mapleview Church, to again try to understand what their congregational needs or requirements were. We've also had a really interesting set of meetings with Emmanuel Baptist Church and Timothy Christian School to begin to understand where their constituents are coming from, what they perceive their needs to be within the community. And within that, we'll call it consortia of neighbors, what their vision is for the neighborhood surrounding. This is our first fulsome conversation with all of you, and so we're very much looking forward to the feedback we received tonight, and in many ways the second conversation once we've had a chance to incorporate some of your input. Some of the themes we've heard to date, and some of these themes will be familiar to you. This is going to sound a little cheeky, but in the upper right you'll see, finally, what took you so long? Well, some of you would have heard rumors of, or maybe been involved in previous conversations about development proposals for this site over the last few years. There has not been a formal planning submission for this site, so this will be the first, and in many ways that's why it took so long, because it took someone like Blake Larson and 7 Generations to move it to this state, where they're actually moving forward with a physical development proposal with an intent to build on the site within the next few years and build really the fulsome range of uses that are being proposed. I started in the upper right, which I wouldn't usually do, so I'll go around clockwise. We like the higher density and pedestrian approach. I know that's not a sentiment shared by everyone, but we'll speak a little bit about that tonight. The design is leaps and bounds improvement on previous schemes. That sounds a little bit gratuitous, but we like where it's going. This is a high profile site in the city of Barrie, and it calls for an iconic design approach, something that stands out and will set it apart. We'll speak about that as we go through the scheme, but I think it's important to note that in our early meetings with the city, it was emphasized the fact that this is an interesting gateway moment when you come into the city via Essa Road and you cross Mapleview. There's the expanse of open landscape, the old field left in fallow, and 2 residential homes, and then the churches. And an opportunity to create a new entry point or gateway or an element at the front of the site, which speaks to really the significance of that entry point into the city, what the city is and what it's becoming. I'll tell you how we've interpreted that in a bit, because it's not necessarily the architecture you see in this middle scheme here. We've thought about it as a mix of uses and maybe an iconic landscape as opposed to an iconic building. We feel that some of the buildings are too tall, and this is much higher density than typical developments in Barrie. And I think we can speak to that tonight. The rationale for the building heights as they're being proposed, but also the structure of the framework we're putting in place. And also, we'd like to hear specifically about your feelings about the community. In many ways, the density that's being proposed here is consistent with what was envisioned within the specific land use categories that are being pursued through the OPA and the zoning amendment, but there's a whole other set of structures that the city needs to consider this in. And so we're very conscious of that and looking forward to the conversation and eventually getting it right, not necessarily trying to force anything onto the site. We see this as part of how we can achieve our targets for job and population growth. And it's really important to understand that the city, through its ongoing developments of its official plan, is trying to achieve population growth, both in terms of residential, but also job population over the next 10, 15, 20, and 30 years. And so how we set the framework for land use conversion like this is always conscious of how many residents are coming into the city at any one time. We don't want too much density along Essa. Concern about relationships to existing residential is key. At all points in early conversations about this site and in ongoing conversations with the councillor and with city staff, they've been consistent in their messaging that the development needs to respect the neighbors on all sides, that it needs to transition or defer in form. It needs to come down towards the existing single family homes. Where there's support, or there may be support for a higher density form of development, it can't be development that has negative impacts in any way on the surrounding residential community. And that needs to be drawn and then assessed, and ultimately it needs to be proven out that that's true as a premise. We'd like to see as many employment type uses as possible. I'll speak about that in a moment. And that's been a regular theme in all our conversations today. The City of Barrie has an official plan, as you know, and that official plan lays out a structure for where jobs would go, where residential growth goes. In 2019, the city began its municipal comprehensive review and review specifically of employment lands, and that included the consideration of lands that should be recommended for conversion from employment, which permits only non-residential uses, commercial and industrial, to mixed uses that allow a range of commercial and residential uses. So the previous slide included a concept that was shown to staff and submitted to city in December of 2019 that was included within the consideration of the municipal comprehensive review for conversion. The initial staff report on May 25th actually recommended the redesignation of this site to support residential and commercial uses. But it's important to note that recommendation did not support the concept that you're seeing tonight. It didn't have a chance to review that concept. The support staff were offering was on the conversion of the land use, not the built form, which is the subject of what we're talking about tonight in the zoning. It's important to note. So what we're looking at here is, on the right-hand side, is a snippet of the official plan. It shows the existing land use, employment in purple. In this case, it shows the general industrial designation. And what we're talking about here is a conversion to a mixed commercial and residential designation that allows for a range of commercial uses, but also a range of residential uses. And I'll speak to that in a moment. What staff have suggested that we do, in addition to the MCR has recommended conversion already, but to harmonize the timing for the zoning amendment submission and the official plan conversion, they've made the recommendation that we submit a site-specific official plan amendment. So what we're talking about tonight is both a zoning amendment submission and an official plan amendment submission. The site, as Dana mentioned, is currently zoned light industrial, and there's 2 residential homes, as you know. There's already a piece of the site right at the corner that's zoned for commercial. What we're intending to do is to amend the zoning for the site to a mixed-use commercial corridor, or mixed-use corridor zoning that allows for the range of uses being proposed, including things like residential apartments for seniors, retirement residents, long-term care, the full replete of residential uses that would accommodate every generation. So here's the vision. I'm sorry it's taking me this long to get to it. I was given 20 minutes, and I'm coming up on that pretty soon. We always begin our projects, no matter the scale, whether it's a single family home or whether it's an entire region, with trying to identify site design principles that are consistent both with our development vision, consistent with the context in the community, and obviously consistent with the objectives of the key stakeholders surrounding the site. And in this case, a large part of the principles that we began our process with came from site observation and the inputs of Blake Larson and his team. First and foremost, we identified the existing really degraded or damaged environment as something that needed repair. And the first priority of this development was to organize the entire community around a repaired Bear Creek, and a Bear Creek that could form the centerpiece of an iconic park landscape. What was brought to us by Blake Larson and his team, 7 generations in their team, was a vision of multi-generational housing and multi-tenure housing. They have a desire to deliver not just housing for any specific point in the market, but housing accessible to both the affordable end spectrum of the market, and we'll say the normal portion of the market, in both the rental and the condominium space. So there will be a range of housing on the site, including up to 40% of the housing that will be rental housing, and a significant portion of which will likely be affordable rental housing. We can speak to that in the questions later on. A portion of it will be condominium housing, and a very significant component, up to 25% of the overall housing, will be dedicated to, we'll call it later generational housing, in the form of long-term care, retirement residence housing, and independent living housing for seniors. That diversity of housing was a critical part of the vision right from the beginning, and that was brought to us by the development team. From conversations with the city, I've already mentioned that there was a desire to acknowledge this site as an important entry point to the city, and to come up with a strategy for positioning this development as a gateway, as an iconic entry point. Our thoughts, as I mentioned, apply to both the architecture, but also the landscape, how we use the landscape to create an iconic place. And then to imagine this as well integrated with the surrounding community. And we anticipate doing that through buildings, through park connections, landscape, through where we position key sensitive uses, maybe institutional pieces within this plan, and how we connect to our neighbors, including the churches, and provide opportunities for shared programming, for shared operations of facilities, including affordable housing, and for shared, we'll call it accessibility solutions for seniors living within the community, accessing the supports within those two church communities. And maybe more than anything, when we're approaching this site as urban designers, we see this, our primary objective as providing a walkable, complete community with all amenities on site. The way that translates into the built form, this is the first time many of you will have seen this, is a primarily mid-rise community with a number of taller elements. The tallest building at the southeast in the current proposal is 27 stories, lowering from 27 to 22 to 18, and then gradually down to 8 along the Essa Road frontage. So the whole building, the whole site steps down towards Essa. Part of the intent in using mid-rise forms, and that includes townhouses and stacked townhouses, is to try to keep a large portion of the site open, not for parking. We're talking about less than 10% of the parking for the whole site being at the surface, and that would only be for convenience parking for access to the neighborhood residential, and the neighborhood retail and the hospitality at grade. The majority of parking will be within the structures and below grade. But by going to this form of the community, we're allowing an incredible network of open spaces and park landscapes that will be accessible to all members of this community and the surrounding neighborhood. You can see through the center of the development, Bear Creek in its repaired form as a kind of broad undulating series of pathways and landscapes, a channel that runs through the site that plays two roles. One, to create a really active recreational hub in the center of the plan, but also it plays a vital role in the stormwater management, the overland flow management from both this property and the surrounding properties. I'll speak a little bit to the uses in the buildings in a moment, but it's really important to note, and since I hope you can all see my cursor here, that we're organizing this plan around a couple of key features. A major public, we're calling it a high street, which is retail focused, with small neighborhood retailers around the core. What we're calling an entertainment center in the heart of the plan that we're anticipating as a food hall with multiple vendors selling food, but also potentially a microbrewery, accessible rooftop and event space. We're looking for a grocer partner to participate in this development within an integrated form. This will be quite different than the existing grocers that exist along Mapleview and the surrounding neighborhoods, a slightly different profile. It'll be more urban in form, integrated within a mixed-use development where at grade, as opposed to parking, you'll have small-scale retail with the grocer at the second floor. And then there's a key piece here that in a way was brought to us through staff from Councillor Gary Harvey, that there was mention in early meetings about the site that one of the potential, we'll call it partnership or collaborative elements that could arrive here would be a library, that there's a need for a library in Southwest Barrie, and there may be an opportunity to bring it here to this site. I want to caveat that by saying that is not by any means a done deal. It's an idea, and it's something that both the development team and we understand the city is interested in looking at further, but it's going to require a lot of work. So all of those elements come together to speak to the mix in the plan. I mean, here's an overall view that again speaks to the open space, the idea that underneath this terrace landscape are a series of residential units, but also parking. Surrounded by residential, so there's no visible parking on site. Lower buildings along the Essa Road frontage, the widened Essa Road. Again, bike lanes along Essa, and then a network of pathways through the site with the taller buildings as far from the residential neighborhood as possible, almost a kilometer from the stable residential neighborhood. The mix of uses that we were brought by Seven Generations, as I mentioned, is on its own quite innovative. Their desire to have both a mix of rental housing, condominium housing, townhouses, long-term care, senior retirement housing, active living, seniors housing, and then maybe most significantly, a whole series of different employment uses, different types of commercial uses on the site, including the long-term care, but ultimately medical office, health and wellness services, conventional office, kind of innovation hub type uses. There's been conversations today about trying to bring a post-secondary institutional partner to the site, and then a number of different types of retail, including the grocer component I mentioned, and then what we're calling neighborhood scale retail that addresses the plaza in the center. A different type of retail environment than currently exists in Southwest Barrie. The overall community plan is segmented into three really interesting pieces: the Gateway neighborhood, the community destination and hub in Bear Creek. The Gateway neighborhood, as I mentioned, is rather than trying to position really iconic architecture at that highly visible moment where you come past Essa or come past Mapleview on Essa or you come past Essa on Mapleview, we're trying to create a hybrid of landscape and architecture where the buildings fold or bend down towards the corner. So it's not a tall, we'll call it obelisk-like element that announces the presence into Barrie. It's the opening up of the site and the visibility into the park that really describes this entry point into the overall neighborhood and community. The use of green roofs is a really critical part of two things, both making sure it's a great residential community, but also making sure from an environmental performance point of view, we're providing extremely, or we'll call it first-class innovative buildings that capture and keep as much of the stormwater on site as possible and minimize the heat load effects of the architecture in the buildings. The community and destination hub is the focal point of the overall plan. It has the most of the commercial uses, all centered around a piece that looks very much like this, a community or food hub and microbrewery right at the center of the plan, with a series of hospitality and small scale retail components that surround the site, that sprinkle around the site. Above all of these elements, there will be residential, mostly apartment rental and some condominium uses. And then the Bear Creek residential neighborhood, which is the diverse residential, the high character neighborhood that surrounds the perimeter of the site. It includes the seniors rental retirement residence, condominium housing, townhouse housing, and in all cases, all the housing relates to both well-scaled neighborhood roads, but also really, really beautiful park landscapes. And that's been a critical part of the plan from the beginning. As I mentioned, the public realm is the big organizing, the arc within which all of this will take place. At the entry point of the plan, as I mentioned before, the public park landscape that will enter into and provide access to the remediated Bear Creek landscape, the small parkettes that surround each one of these buildings, and then the accessible rooftop courtyards that I spoke about earlier, the green roofs that'll be accessible to residents, and a number of them, including the one adjacent to the entertainment center and food hub in the middle, accessible to visitors. A really key part of all of this is also bringing the water, as opposed to, as many of you are familiar with, the typical approach to stormwater management in sites like this is to create a large fenced-in contained pond that provides both a quantity and quality storage facility for stormwater on site. We're very interested in using that water as much as we can to be an amenity within the landscape and trying to put it close to some of the commercial ventures so you create a really unique quality between those retail and hospitality venues and the outdoor park landscapes. The channel is maybe the most unique part of this whole proposal, that we could begin to imagine a rehabilitated Bear Creek that's occupiable, that you can walk through on on trails that connect both into Ems Drive within the neighborhood to the northwest and across the Mapleview Church site to access the playing field to our immediate southeast. We're working with the Conservation Authority and the City of Barrie on this plan now, trying to develop some characteristics for this that both allow it to perform its stormwater function while still providing a tremendous amount of amenity for all its users. And then the linear parks that adjacent to the buildings themselves. This is towards the end of the presentation, just to bring you another of the key considerations brought to us by Center Generations Development, was that there would be an opportunity here with seniors, with families, and with first-time buyers and renters living within this community to try to create an overall development with a unique focus on mobility and accessibility. So one of the challenges given to us was how do we create two things: a continuous summer circuit that would be an outdoor pathway and a series of pathways and trails that really connect all aspects of this community with the adjacent communities, and an interior pathway that connects all the buildings, lobbies, and interior shared spaces so that residents and visitors could actually circulate through the entirety of the community year-round, winter, summer, spring, and fall. This is just a map at the moment. Eventually, it'll translate into a more legible design, but we thought it was worth sharing that that's one of the key ambitions for this, is that it's a four-season community where people can live indoor and outdoors through all parts of the year. The phasing strategy is really subject to how a lot of this process goes. The current thinking is that the first phases of development will be along Mapleview, and the likely first phases of development will be at the southeast corner, directly northwest of the intersection of Hollyholme and Mapleview. The very first works that'll take place on the site, subject to permitting, are the remediation of the channel itself and the building of the park landscape around the channel, and then the building of a small sales pavilion, which will be at the southwest of the development. The phasing, of course, will be different portions of this plan will come online contingent on how the process works with the city, specifically how conversations go with relation to libraries and other kind of partnership elements such as long-term care and retirement residents that will come in phase 2 and phase 3. But this is a draft version of the phasing plan going forward. So this is where we are. Our next steps include compiling and reviewing your feedback and preparing for a list of key themes that we heard tonight. That we'll review with the city and make sure we got it right, and then to amend the materials we're reviewing tonight prior to making submission to the city within the next month. We're going to discuss what we heard with city staff and how we can address it in the proposal, and then of course prepare the official zoning amendment and official plan amendment submissions. And then of course, the next phase for us is working with the city beyond the submission, receiving the city's comments and preparing for the second meeting, which will take place later this year in late 2020. So again, these are the very high level questions and discussion starters we were hoping to leave with you. We're very interested in hearing your feedback on what uses, what key amenities and services you'd like to see on this site. Restaurants, grocery stores, medical offices. Are there other elements that you feel would be beneficial to Holly and the surrounding neighborhood? The opportunities to enhance the great neighborhood. Are there things we're missing in the gateway parks, in the open spaces, or even in the food hall, or some of the architecture that would be of interest to you? What are your concerns? And those concerns can apply to built form, they can apply to the type of housing, and they can apply to the architecture, or they can apply to the scale. But we want to hear exactly what your feelings are on the plan the way it is today, and we want to hear your ideas.